When the lawyer slid a single brass key across the table, Sarah almost laughed. Who inherits a train car in 2025? But what she found inside that rusted relic, hidden beneath decades of dust and steel, didn't just change her life. It rewrote history. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to hit subscribe. Because tomorrow's story will blow your mind in ways you'll never see coming. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish, the kind of scent that clung to places where nothing truly new had happened in years. Sarah Dawson sat stiffly on the other side of the oak desk, her waitress uniform hidden under a thrift store jacket, her hair tied back in a loose knot that had frayed during her shift. The hum of the fluorescent light above them buzzed like a mosquito in her ear. She thought about the hours she'd spent slinging coffee that morning, the ache in her feet, the exhaustion still crawling through her bones, and wondered how she'd ended up here, talking about some inheritance she never expected and didn't have time to care about. "Your Uncle Arthur," the lawyer said, peering at her over thin glasses, "left you his only property." Sarah forced a polite nod, though the name meant nothing. Arthur Dawson. She had never met him, never seen him at family gatherings, or even heard her mother mention him without a shadow of disapproval. Family ghost, she thought, the kind people buried in stories no one wanted to tell. She expected land, a run-down cabin, maybe, if she was lucky, a patch of desert she could sell to cover rent for a few months. Something practical, something that explained why she'd driven 3 hours after her shift ended, leaving Ethan with her neighbor and promising she'd be back before bedtime. But then the lawyer reached into a drawer and pulled out a single brass key. No paperwork thick as a phone book, no deeds or maps, just that. He slid it across the desk toward her, the metal scraping against the wood with a soft sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Sarah frowned. "That's it?" The lawyer gave a weary half-smile. "Car number 147, Union Pacific, stored outside Rhyolite, Nevada. Your uncle's been paying storage fees for nearly 4 decades. Her laugh came out sharp, incredulous. "A car?" "Not the kind you drive," he corrected, adjusting his glasses. "A train car, 1972 build, from what I've gathered. Rusting on a private siding since the late 70s. Most families sell them for scrap." He shrugged like he was apologizing for the inconvenience, as though this rusty relic was little more than a burden being shuffled from one Dawson to another. Sarah stared at the brass key, its surface dulled by years, but still catching the light in places. It shouldn't have meant anything, and yet her stomach twisted in a way she couldn't explain. The tag tied to it was worn leather, cracked at the edges, and in faded ink were 3 words: "Car number 147, Union Pacific." She reached out hesitantly, letting her fingers brush the cool metal. It was heavier than it looked, warm almost, like it had been sitting in sunlight, though it had just come from a drawer. For reasons she couldn't pin down, the weight of it felt alive, humming faintly against her palm, as if it carried memory. The lawyer continued droning about fees, about the paperwork she'd need to sign if she wanted to claim ownership or transfer it, but his voice blurred. She was somewhere else entirely, standing in a desert she had never seen, a row of abandoned cars stretching into the distance, one of them waiting for her. She forced herself to nod, signing where he pointed, though her mind wasn't on the forms. It was on the key, the way it pressed into her skin like it belonged there. When she finally stepped out into the afternoon air, the sun blazing against her face, Sarah slipped the key into her jacket pocket. It rested there with a weight far greater than brass, pulling at her thoughts even as she started the car and headed back toward Ethan. She told herself it was just another responsibility, another useless thing life had dumped on her already overstuffed plate. But deep down, beneath the layers of fatigue and cynicism, something whispered louder. This wasn't just a train car, it wasn't scrap metal or forgotten history, it was a door, and she had just been handed the key. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a canvas of heat and silence broken only by the shimmer of mirages and the occasional skeleton of a roadside billboard. Sarah gripped the steering wheel of her aging sedan, knuckles pale from the effort of keeping the car steady on cracked asphalt. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, legs pulled up, sketchbook balanced on his knees. He'd been quiet most of the drive, humming under his breath, occasionally glancing out the window, as if waiting for the desert itself to reveal something. After 6 hours of dust, gas station coffee, and the kind of silence that grows heavy between mother and son, the dirt road finally narrowed into a path cutting through scrub and sand. Ahead lay the rail yard, or what was left of it. The siding was a boneyard of history, where hulking train cars sagged on rusted wheels, their paint flaked away by decades of sun, weeds coiled up their sides like skeletal fingers. The air itself seemed thinner here, carrying the faint scent of iron and old storms. Sarah parked and killed the engine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The place felt wrong, like they'd stumbled into a graveyard where the dead hadn't been properly laid to rest. Then Ethan finally broke the silence, his voice sharp with disappointment. "We came all this way? For that?" His finger pointed, and Sarah followed the line of his arm. Separated from the other cars by just enough distance to feel intentional, car number 147 waited. Its paint, once a proud industrial orange, had bleached into a colorless husk. Steel plates bore scars of corrosion like wounds frozen in time. The number, faint but still visible, clung to the side in faded black. Sarah didn't answer her son. Words felt too fragile in the face of something that seemed to hum with memory. She stepped out, the desert heat slamming into her, and crossed the sand toward the car. Each step felt like trespassing. She reached the steel wall and pressed her palm against it. It was cool despite the sun, as though the car had been holding its breath all these years, waiting. A shiver threaded down her spine. The sliding door was secured with a padlock. It looked ancient, its brass dulled and pitted, but it hadn't broken with time. Someone had locked this door carefully, deliberately, and for decades no one had opened it. Sarah pulled the brass key from her pocket. Its weight seemed heavier than usual. She fit it into the lock. Ethan leaned close, eyes wide. "Do you think it'll work?" Sarah turned it slowly, expecting resistance, expecting Rust to fight her. Instead, the lock clicked open as smoothly as if it had been oiled yesterday. The sound was too clean, too practiced, as though the mechanism had been waiting for her specifically. Her chest tightened. She slid the door. Metal shrieked against metal, the noise sharp and painful, scattering birds from a telephone wire nearby. Dust burst outward in a choking cloud, filling the sunlight with 1,000 glittering motes. Sarah coughed, shielding her face with her arm. When the air settled, she and Ethan peered inside. The car was a cavern of shadow, its air thick with a smell both metallic and strangely sweet, like pennies soaked in honey. Sunlight carved narrow beams through slats in the walls, illuminating rows of objects under canvas tarps, crates, barrels, machines, indistinct shapes hunched in the dark, waiting like ghosts, too shy to show their faces all at once. Ethan clutched her sleeve. "Mom." His voice dropped to a whisper, awe tinged with fear. "What is all this?" Sarah didn't answer. Her throat had gone dry. She stepped 1 foot inside, the wooden floor groaning faintly under her weight. It felt like crossing a threshold into another world, one left untouched by time, yet heavy with the weight of every year it had been sealed. She didn't know what her uncle had left her. She only knew this much. Whatever it was not meant to stay hidden forever. And now that she'd opened the door, there was no turning back. The air inside was heavy, the kind that clung to the skin and carried secrets in its weight. Sarah hesitated at the threshold, her flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. The beam cut through the gloom and revealed what the desert had kept hidden all these years. This wasn't a forgotten husk filled with rust and rats. It was a room locked in time. Crates stacked in disciplined rows hugged the walls, their wood darkened by age, edges worn soft by decades of stillness. Metal barrels stood in formation down the center aisle, like soldiers frozen mid-watch. Tarps, stiff with dust, draped over machinery whose outlines were bulky and unfamiliar. Every surface was muted beneath layers of grit, yet the arrangement wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone had stored these things with purpose. Ethan coughed lightly behind her, the sound loud in the quiet. "It's like a museum," he whispered, his voice caught between awe and unease. His small sneakers crunched on the floorboards as he stepped closer, one hand gripping the hem of her jacket like a lifeline. Sarah's eyes scanned the walls. Faint chalk marks, nearly erased by time, streaked across the wood of certain crates. She leaned closer, squinting. Most were just blurred lines, shapes that meant nothing now. But one stood clearer than the rest. Her light caught it fully. A. Dawson, 1976. Her breath snagged. The name wasn't just coincidence. Arthur Dawson, the uncle she never knew. The one who had left her, this rusted inheritance. She touched the crate, brushing away layers of dust until the chalk smeared onto her fingertips. It was real. His handwriting, maybe. His possession. This wasn't a stranger's storage. It was her bloodline's buried story. The air seemed to thrum louder now, the silence no longer empty but crowded, pressing in. She pulled back a tarp covering something large. Dust cascaded like ash, revealing the gleam of iron beneath. She recognized it, though she had only seen such things in documentaries. An industrial printing press, compact yet unmistakably powerful. Not the kind for newspapers or flyers. This one was precise, unforgiving, built for official engravings. Her pulse quickened. The government used machines like this. Currency, bonds, documents that demanded perfection. She stepped back as if the machine might roar to life and accuse her of trespassing. Her uncle hadn't been a collector of junk. He'd been keeping something far bigger, and he'd hidden it in the middle of nowhere, sealed under lock and key for nearly half a century. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice small. He was crouched beside one of the barrels. She turned her light and froze. The barrel's lid wasn't just closed, it was sealed with hardened wax. Stamped into the surface was a symbol she didn't recognize, a circle with intersecting lines like a compass stripped of direction. It looked official, maybe foreign. It looked dangerous. "Don't touch it," Sarah said sharply, more than she meant to. Her tone made Ethan jerk his hand back instantly. She softened her voice, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We don't know what this is." They didn't touch anything else. They didn't dare. The longer Sarah stood in that car, the more the silence grew teeth, gnawing at the edges of her resolve. This wasn't storage. This wasn't scrap. This was a puzzle, and puzzles with names, with printing presses, with sealed barrels, puzzles left behind by men who disappeared, rarely came without danger. When they finally stepped out into the sunlight again, it was as if they were surfacing from underwater, gulping air greedily. The desert heat felt almost merciful after the chill inside. Ethan said nothing on the drive back to the motel. He stared out the window, clutching his sketchbook to his chest like it could protect him. Sarah gripped the wheel tight, the brass key heavy in her pocket. That night in the cheap motel room, while Ethan slept curled on his side, Sarah lay awake listening to the hum of the air conditioner. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the chalk letters, the printing press, the sealed wax. Her uncle hadn't left her a train car. He had left her a riddle carved in steel, and she couldn't shake the feeling that solving it might come at a cost. Somewhere out there, someone had been waiting for this secret to stay buried. And now, by unlocking that door, she had disturbed it. She turned onto her back, staring at the ceiling, her chest heavy with realization. She hadn't inherited a piece of history. She had inherited a threat. And if there was one thing she knew for certain, it was this: people kill for less. The diner smelled like grease and burnt coffee, the way it always did near closing, when the fryers had been running too long and the pot of house blend had sat untouched on the warmer for hours. Sarah moved on autopilot, wiping counters, topping off mugs, forcing smiles that felt paper thin. The evening had been uneventful, just another blur of refills and orders called out over the hiss of the grill. Her feet ached, her shoulders were tight, but she was used to that. What she wasn't used to was the weight of the brass key pressing against her thigh through the pocket of her uniform. She kept touching it unconsciously, checking to make sure it was still there, as though it might vanish if she didn't. At first, she didn't notice him. The man in the gray suit had slipped into the far corner booth, the one half hidden beneath the flickering neon light that made everything look a little too sharp. He wasn't eating. No menu lay on the table, no glass of water sweating condensation. Just him, his back straight, hands folded, gaze fixed. Watching. Sarah busied herself with a table of truckers, finishing pie, tried to shake off the prickling sensation running down her neck. But when she turned again, his eyes were still on her. Not hungry, not impatient. Just steady, like he was waiting for something inevitable. She forced herself to approach, coffee pot in hand, her smile rehearsed. "Evening," she said, her voice carrying that brittle cheer she'd perfected for years. "Coffee?" He nodded once. She poured, the liquid steaming as it filled the cup, but as she set the pot back on her hip, he leaned in slightly, his voice low, smooth and wrong in a way that made her skin crawl. "Car number 147. Belonged to your uncle, didn't it?" The world seemed to tilt. Sarah froze, the blood rushing to her ears so fast she almost didn't hear her own breath hitch. Her name tag caught the neon light, flashing briefly as if to confirm that yes, she was Sarah Dawson. Yes, she was the one he'd been looking for. She tried to keep her voice level, casual, though her hand tightened around the coffee pot. "How do you know that?" The man's lips curved into a faint smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "Men like your uncle didn't just collect steel," he said softly, like he was reciting something from memory. "They collected secrets. And secrets, Miss Dawson, have a way of outliving the men who kept them." Her throat went dry. She wanted to demand answers, wanted to ask who he was, how he knew about the key, the car, her uncle, but the words stuck. She was suddenly aware of the other customers, the hum of conversation, the clatter of cutlery, the normalcy of the diner pressed against the abnormality of this man, like two mismatched puzzle pieces forced together. He sat back, not bothering to sip the coffee she'd poured. Instead, he reached into his jacket, pulled out a crisp 20 and set it on the table. "Be careful who you show that key to," he said, his tone polite but edged with something colder, heavier. Then he slid out of the booth, smoothed his suit jacket, and walked toward the door. Sarah's eyes followed him, her chest tight. He didn't glance back, didn't hesitate, just pushed into the night, as though he belonged more to the shadows outside than to the fluorescent glare within. The bell above the door jingled faintly, and then he was gone. The 20 sat on the table, untouched coffee cooling beside it. Sarah picked it up with hands that trembled more than she wanted to admit. She couldn't shake the sound of his voice, the way he had spoken her uncle's secrets like he owned them. How had he known? And more importantly, what kind of man had her uncle been, if strangers in suits were still whispering about him 40 years later? Her stomach twisted as she turned back to the counter, the brass key burning hotter in her pocket than it ever had before. The morning light slipped through the blinds in thin, dusty lines, striping the small kitchen table where Sarah had left a clutter of papers from the lawyer's office. The smell of burnt toast filled the air, and somewhere in the background a kettle whistled softly before fading into silence. Sarah stood at the sink, half awake, staring at the reflection of her own tired eyes in the window. The events of the past week felt like a strange fever dream. The drive to the desert, the rusted train car, the man in the diner who had known too much. Every moment pressed on her chest like the weight of something that hadn't yet finished happening. Behind her, Ethan shuffled papers. He was always curious, always looking for the story inside the silence. "Mom," he said, his voice cutting through the haze of her thoughts. "What's this?" Sarah turned. He sat cross-legged on the chair, elbows buried in a mess of documents, the edge of an old folded paper clutched between his fingers. The parchment looked older than the rest, yellowed, fragile, the corners brittle with time. She frowned, drying her hands on a towel. "Where'd you find that?" "It was inside that envelope from the lawyer," he said, spreading it open carefully across the table. The lines of a technical drawing sprawled across the page, precise, mechanical, and hauntingly familiar. Sarah stepped closer, her pulse quickening. It was the train car. The layout was unmistakable. Car number 147, Union Pacific. Every inch of it was labeled in neat ink, down to the rivets and floor panels. But it was the bottom corner that froze her breath. "False floor compartment, 12 feet." The words stared back at her like a warning. She blinked, hoping she was misreading, but there it was, clear, deliberate. Someone had built an entire hidden space beneath the floor. Her stomach turned cold. Ethan put that away. "Why?" His voice rose with excitement. "It's like a secret map. Maybe Grandpa Arthur left something down there, like treasure." His grin widened, that spark of boyish wonder lighting up his face. Sarah wished she could match his smile, but her hands trembled as she ran a finger over the paper, tracing the faint pencil marks. Her uncle hadn't just hidden things. He'd hidden them well. "Mom, we have to go back," Ethan said. "We didn't even see anything like that before." Sarah pressed her palm against the blueprint, flattening it to the table. "No," she said softly, "we're not going back." "Why not?" "Because—" She stopped. The truth snagged in her throat. Because people who hide things under steel floors don't do it for fun. Because men in suits don't show up at diners for scrap metal. Because the kind of secrets her uncle kept didn't stay buried without reason. But Ethan's face, the pure, unguarded hope there, disarmed her. He wasn't afraid, not yet. He was curious, like all children are, before the world teaches them that curiosity has a cost. She sat beside him, her voice gentler now. "Sweetheart, sometimes when adults hide things, it's because they don't want them to be found." He studied her face for a long moment, then said quietly, "You're scared." Sarah forced a smile. "I'm cautious." "It's the same thing." He said it with the blunt honesty only a 10-year-old could manage. Then, before she could reply, he tapped the corner of the blueprint. "But what if it's something good? Like something he wanted us to find? Why would he leave us the key if he didn't want us to open it?" The logic was childish and flawless all at once. Sarah looked down at the drawing again, the lines blurring as her eyes welled. A false floor meant hidden cargo, and hidden cargo meant danger. But what if it also meant truth? Something her uncle couldn't say out loud, something he'd buried for her to uncover when it was safe. Ethan's hand brushed hers. "Maybe he left it for you, Mom." Her throat tightened. She could tell him no. Tell him they'd forget about the car, about the blueprint, about everything. But she couldn't lie to him, not when his eyes shone with belief in something bigger than fear. That afternoon, while Ethan was at school, Sarah sat alone at the table, the blueprint spread before her. The lines seemed to breathe, whispering of secrets, of danger, of promise. She wanted to burn it, to tear it apart and throw it in the sink with the rest of the day's trash. But she didn't. She folded it neatly, tucked it inside her jacket pocket, and closed her eyes. Maybe this inheritance wasn't a curse after all. Maybe it was a chance. A key not just to a secret, but to something she'd forgotten how to believe in. Hope. The wind over the desert came cold at night, the kind that slipped through clothes and bones, humming across the empty land like something alive. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness, and Sarah's grip on the steering wheel was so tight, her knuckles had gone white. Ethan sat beside her, half asleep, his head bobbing with the rhythm of the car over the uneven road. She hadn't planned to bring him, but she couldn't leave him behind, not after the way the key had started to feel heavier in her pocket, as though it were calling her back to the train car. They hadn't spoken much on the drive. The silence between them was thick, interrupted only by the hum of the tires and the occasional sigh from the engine. Sarah tried not to think about the man in the diner, or the words that had stayed with her like a warning that wouldn't fade. Be careful who you show that key to. She hadn't shown it to anyone, but somehow, someone knew. The desert opened before them, black and endless, until the outline of the rail yard rose out of the dark. The old train cars stood like grave markers under the pale glow of a sickle moon. Even from a distance, Sarah knew something was wrong. The shadows looked disturbed, too open, too rearranged. The air itself felt wrong, restless, as if it remembered violence. She parked a few yards away and cut the engine. The silence afterward was deafening. Ethan stirred, blinking the sleep from his eyes. "We're here?" he murmured, rubbing his face. "Stay in the car," she said, but her voice was too thin to convince even herself. She stepped out, boots crunching softly against the dirt. The night pressed close, and for the first time she noticed the faint metallic tang in the air, sharp and unnatural. The train car came into view, car number 147, its shape both familiar and foreign now. She reached for the padlock without thinking. It was gone. What remained was a twisted shard of brass still clinging to the latch like a broken tooth. Her stomach dropped. "Mom?" Ethan's small voice carried across the stillness. He was standing a few feet behind her now, despite her instructions. The wind tugged at his hair. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer. She slid the door open, half afraid of what she'd see, half afraid she wouldn't find anything at all. The smell hit her first. Dust unsettled. After too many years of sleep, the faint scent of rust and something older, like time itself, had been scraped raw. Her flashlight beam wavered across the interior. Crates had been overturned, their contents spilled out in heaps. Tarps lay torn open like carcasses, their stiff folds shredded. Someone had been searching, and they hadn't cared about being gentle. "Mom." Ethan's whisper trembled. "Who did this?" Sarah swallowed hard, her heart thudding. She moved the light across the barrels, lined up exactly as before, sealed, untouched. Whoever had come here hadn't found what they were looking for. The hidden compartment beneath the floor, the one her uncle had kept secret, hadn't been discovered. Not yet. She exhaled shakily, gripping Ethan's shoulder. "We need to go," she said, her voice barely holding steady. Ethan frowned. "But what if they come back?" Her throat tightened. "That's exactly why we're leaving." They stepped out of the car, sliding the door closed behind them. The desert air felt colder now, alive with something unseen. Sarah scanned the darkness, every flicker of shadow a potential threat. No footprints, no vehicles, nothing but silence, stretching in every direction, but she could feel it in her bones. They weren't alone in this anymore. When she finally started the car, Ethan's hand slipped into hers. He didn't speak, but his fingers were small and warm against her trembling palm. As the engine roared to life and the headlights cut through the dark once more, Sarah caught one last glimpse of the rail yard in the rearview mirror. Car number 147 sat there in the moonlight, silent and waiting, but no longer forgotten. Someone else knew now. Someone else was searching. And as the desert swallowed the train yard behind them, Sarah understood that she hadn't just inherited her uncle's secret. She'd inherited his enemies too. The sun was already high by the time Sarah pulled into the rail yard again, its heat pressing against her shoulders like a warning she didn't care to hear. She had barely slept, and when she did, her dreams were filled with metallic echoes, the sound of that broken padlock, the image of shadows moving where they shouldn't. Now, in the clear light of day, the place seemed almost ordinary, stripped of the menace that had haunted her at night. Almost. Ethan trailed a few steps behind her, his backpack slung over one shoulder, holding the flashlight and a bottle of water like this was some grand adventure. To him, it probably was. To Sarah, it was survival. The blueprint burned in her mind with every step. False floor compartment, 12 feet. She had read those words so many times she could see them even when she closed her eyes. She climbed into car 147, the same creak of the old metal greeting her like a ghost. The air inside was dry and heavy, thick with the smell of old oil and heat. The floorboards shimmered faintly where the sunlight slipped through the cracks in the wall, dust swirling in lazy spirals. The chaos from the break-in was still there, crates overturned, debris scattered. But it was the undisturbed middle of the car that pulled her attention. The barrels, the floor beneath them. "Stay by the door," she said, her voice steady, though her hands weren't. Ethan crouched near the entrance, curiosity bright in his eyes. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah didn't answer. She pulled a crowbar from the trunk of the car and wedged it into a seam in the floor. The first push did nothing. The second made her wrist ache. The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed through the empty car, sharp and shrill. Then, faintly, something shifted, a groan from deep within the steel. She paused, sweat beating at her temples. One more push, and the edge gave way. A hiss of air escaped from below as the panel lifted, slow and reluctant, like the car itself resented her intrusion. Beneath the floor was a hollow space, perfectly measured, perfectly hidden. She knelt, her heart pounding, and swept her flashlight into the dark cavity. There, stacked with military precision, were rectangular metal cases, identical and spotless despite the decades. Each one bore the same stamp across its side, U.S. Treasury, 1974. Sarah froze. For a moment she thought she was imagining it, her mind conjuring ghosts of history to make sense of what she saw. But when she reached down and touched one of the cases, it was real. Cold, solid, and humming faintly with the weight of its contents. Ethan leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "What is it?" Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted one of the cases onto the floor. The latch opened with a satisfying click. She hesitated, then raised the lid. Bundles of $100 bills lay inside, tightly packed, crisp, and untouched by time. The smell of paper and ink hit her like a wave, clean, sterile, official. Each stack bore the familiar face of Franklin, pristine beneath a thin layer of age. Ethan's eyes went wide, his jaw slack. "Mom, are we rich?" For a heartbeat, she let herself look, really look, at the sheer amount of money, more than she had ever seen, more than she could even comprehend. Her breath caught in her throat, but the thought didn't feel like triumph. It felt like falling. She slammed the case shut, the sound cracking through the still air. "No," she said firmly, her voice trembling despite herself. "We're in trouble." Ethan blinked, startled. "Trouble? But this isn't just money," she said, her gaze locked on the stacked cases. The Treasury seal like an accusation staring back. "This is stolen federal currency, probably never meant to exist. If someone hid it here, they didn't want it found." The boy looked confused, his face scrunching up in the sunlight filtering through the slats. "But it's been here forever." "Nobody even remembered," Sarah shook her head. "Someone remembered. Someone broke that lock. And if they find out we've been here—" Her eyes darted toward the open door, the emptiness beyond it suddenly feeling full of watching eyes. "Ethan, we can't tell anyone about this. Not the police, not the lawyer, no one." He nodded slowly, sensing the gravity beneath her tone. "So what do we do?" Sarah looked back at the open compartment, at the secret her uncle had buried in steel and time. "We put it back," she said softly, "and then we figure out why he did it, before someone else does." As she sealed the hatch again, and the desert wind sighed through the broken seams of the car, Sarah couldn't shake the chill crawling up her spine. She'd come looking for answers. But now she'd found something far worse. Proof that her uncle's secret wasn't just dangerous, it was worth killing for. The county records office sat at the end of Main Street, a squat brick building that smelled faintly of mildew and old paper. Its air was stale, preserved like the memories of the dead that filled its filing cabinets. Sarah stood at the front desk, hands gripping the counter, her voice low but determined. "Arthur Dawson," she said, "my uncle. I need everything you have on him, property, employment, anything." The clerk, a woman with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, gave her a long, practiced look. "Year of death?" Not sure he actually died, Sarah said quietly. Around 1975, maybe. The woman frowned, tapping keys on a faded keyboard. The screen reflected dull blue light across her face. "There's a record," she said after a moment, "but it's old, real old. You'll want the paper file. Basement Archives." She scribbled a note and pointed to a door behind her. "Down the stairs, cabinet 37. Hope you brought patience." The basement was colder, the kind of cold that lived in concrete and didn't leave even in summer. Fluorescent bulbs flickered weakly overhead. Dust motes swam in the air as Sarah made her way down narrow aisles of forgotten history. When she finally found cabinet 37, the drawer squealed in protest as she pulled it open. Files, yellow and brittle, crowded together like whispers waiting to be heard. Arthur Dawson. There it was, his name typed neatly on the tab. Sarah slid it free and laid it on a nearby table. The first few pages were mundane: birth certificate, business registration for Dawson Printing Company, tax filings from the late 60s. He'd been a printing contractor, she realized. That much tracked, but then came the newspaper clipping: local printer missing after warehouse fire. The headline was dated 1975. Beneath it, a grainy photograph of a smoking building, flames curling through broken windows. Her uncle's name appeared in the text, listed among the presumed dead. Investigators had found traces of accelerant, no remains. Sarah leaned closer, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. A fire without a body, a man who worked in printing, a train car filled with treasury cases. The puzzle pieces began to shift into place, and for the first time, she felt the chill of realization take root. She flipped another page. Behind the news clipping, something unexpected, an envelope marked "Restricted." FBI correspondence. It was stamped "Semi-sealed, internal use only." Someone had folded it neatly and slipped it into the local file decades ago, perhaps by mistake. Her heart thudded. She unfolded the papers inside. Most of the text had been redacted, long black bars obscuring lines like scars, but fragments remained. Suspect believed to have fled with materials connected to Federal Reserve shipment, serials untraceable. Evidence points to internal collusion within Treasury contracting. Primary target: a Dawson, location unknown. Sarah's breath came shallow. Her uncle hadn't died in that fire. He'd vanished to keep something hidden, and whatever he'd stolen or tried to expose was sitting in her train car, sealed under steel and time. The final page of the report was a typewritten memo, unsigned, dated months after the fire. Intelligence indicates a subject may have relocated asset west via private rail. Monitoring suspended 1982 due to inactivity. Recommend case status unresolved. Her hands went still. The air in the archive seemed to press inward, heavy and electric. Unresolved. The word rattled through her like an echo. It wasn't money she'd uncovered. It was the residue of a heist buried deep enough to be forgotten. Her uncle had stolen from the government, or from someone inside it, and disappeared before they could silence him. Sarah closed the file carefully, as if any sudden movement might wake ghosts. The sound of the drawer sliding shut rang louder than it should have. Upstairs, the clerk barely glanced at her when she returned the papers. "Find what you needed?" Sarah forced a tight smile. "More than I wanted." Outside, the late afternoon sun glared bright enough to sting her eyes, but she barely noticed. Her pulse was still quick, her thoughts racing. The rusty train car wasn't just a relic of her uncle's strange past. It was the smoking gun of the biggest unsolved heist in modern history, one that could ruin lives, topple reputations, maybe even get her killed. She slipped the folded memo into her bag, her fingers brushing against the brass key she still carried everywhere. It was warm again, like it always seemed to be when she got too close to the truth. Sarah looked back once at the brick building, its windows glowing pale against the sky, and whispered under her breath, "What did you do, Uncle Arthur?" The wind offered no answer, only the faint hum of the desert beyond, like whispers of the past, restless and waiting for her to listen. The motel parking lot was half lit by a flickering bulb that buzzed like a trapped insect, throwing long, twitching shadows across the cracked asphalt. The air smelled of stale coffee from the lobby, and the faint tang of motor oil from the cars lined up against the curb. Sarah had just stepped out to breathe, the quiet pressing around her like a heavy coat. Inside their room, Ethan sat at the small table, head bent over his homework, the lamplight soft against his hair. For one small moment, the world felt almost normal. Then she saw him. The man from the diner, the gray suit, the calm smile that never reached his eyes. He leaned against a dark sedan parked under the lone streetlight, hands tucked casually into his pockets. When he spoke, his voice carried that same controlled smoothness, a tone that pretended to be polite but dripped with ownership. "Evening, Miss Dawson." Her pulse spiked. She froze where she stood, keys clenched tight in her hand. "How did you find me?" He shrugged as though the answer didn't matter. "You're not exactly hiding. There are only 3 motels in this county, and only one registers under your name. Not very hard to guess." Her stomach knotted. "What do you want?" He pushed off the car and took a slow step forward. The movement was deliberate, like a predator that had already decided the outcome. "I represent a group with vested interests in historical recoveries," he said. "You have something they want. Or rather, you're standing on something they want." Her throat tightened. "The train car." He smiled faintly, almost approving. "Good. No use dancing around it." He reached into his jacket pocket, not fast but enough to make Sarah's breath catch, then pulled out a white envelope. "Here's the offer. $100,000 cash. You sign over access to the car, and we handle everything. Quietly. Legally, even. If you prefer that illusion." The words hit her like a blow. $100,000. It was too much and not enough all at once. Her mind flashed through a blur of numbers, unpaid bills, past due rent, the old car that coughed and rattled like it was dying, Ethan's school lunches she sometimes skipped to pay for. That kind of money could erase the panic that haunted her every night. It could buy breathing room, safety, but then, through the cracked motel window, she saw Ethan. His pencil moved across the page, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. He didn't know what danger was circling outside, didn't know that his mother was one decision away from selling their safety for silence. Sarah looked back at the man. "You want me to sell my uncle's secret?" "I want to relieve you of a burden," he said. "You're in over your head. You have a child to think about. The smart choice is to walk away before this becomes something uglier." Her fingers dug into her palm. "And if I say no?" His smile didn't fade, but something colder flickered behind his eyes. "Then I'd suggest you be careful. You're not the only Dawson who's tried to keep secrets." The sentence landed like ice in her chest. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head slightly, the ghost of amusement curling his mouth. "Your uncle thought he could control the story, too." He was wrong. Before she could respond, he slipped the envelope onto the hood of her car, gave her a small, polite nod, and turned toward his sedan. The engine started with a soft purr, and the taillights glowed red as he disappeared down the road, leaving only the faint hum of the desert night behind him. Sarah stood still, staring at the envelope, her breath fogging in the cooling air. The paper seemed to pulse in the half-light, heavy with promises she didn't trust. Finally, she picked it up and tore it open. Stacks of crisp bills filled the envelope, along with a single business card. Ryder and Company Acquisitions. No phone number, no address, just the name. Inside, Ethan yawned and stretched. "Mom?" he called. "You coming in?" Sarah slipped the envelope into her jacket, her heart pounding. "Yeah, baby," she said softly. "Just a minute." She stood there a little longer, staring out at the horizon where the desert met the night. She thought of her uncle, of the fire that was supposed to have killed him, of the crates marked U.S. Treasury, 1974. $100,000 could solve everything she'd ever worried about. but it wouldn't buy her soul back. When she finally stepped into the room, Ethan looked up and smiled at her. That was the moment she knew her answer. Selling the car wasn't safety. It was surrender. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the business card, and tore it clean in half. Sleep refused to find her. The motel room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioner struggling against the desert heat and the steady rhythm of Ethan's breathing from the other bed. The glow from the parking lot light bled through the blinds, slicing the darkness into narrow bands across the walls. Sarah sat on the edge of her mattress, elbows on her knees, staring at the floor where her shadow looked more like a stranger than herself. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them. The barrels, their seals untouched, the wax stamped with that strange symbol she couldn't name. She could almost hear the metal cases clinking softly beneath the false floor like a heartbeat, buried under layers of steel. What else had her uncle hidden there? More cash? Stolen bonds? Or something worse, something that had made powerful men desperate enough to kill for it? She pressed her palms together, the ache in her chest growing tighter with each breath. The envelope the suited man had left still sat on the table, the edges bent where she'd gripped it too hard. $100,000. Enough to make her problems disappear, but not enough to quiet her conscience. It was tainted, every bill a piece of blood money waiting to claim its next debt. Sarah looked toward Ethan. He'd kicked off the blanket again, curled in a tangle of limbs, his face peaceful in sleep. There was something about the way he slept that always undid her. No matter how hard the world had been, he slept like he believed it couldn't reach him, like she could protect him from everything. But tonight, that belief felt fragile. She got up quietly, crossing to the window. The glass was cold beneath her fingertips. Outside, the parking lot was empty, save for a single flickering light and the faint hum of the highway beyond. Somewhere in that darkness, she knew someone was still watching, men who didn't need names, only orders. She thought of the one in the gray suit, his calm, unhurried voice. "You're not the only Dawson who's tried to keep secrets." The words echoed like a curse. Arthur Dawson had vanished to protect something, maybe even her, though she'd never know it for sure. And now, decades later, the danger he'd tried to bury was staring her in the face. The train car wasn't an inheritance. It was a target. Her reflection in the glass looked different. The same tired eyes, but harder now, more resolved. She'd always thought fear was something you either ran from or fought against. But motherhood had taught her the cruelest truth. Sometimes fear stayed with you, lived inside your ribs, whispering what you'd lose if you failed. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of Ethan, living without her. Behind her, he stirred and murmured something in his sleep, a half-formed word, maybe her name. She turned back, her throat tightening. "It's okay, baby," she whispered, though her voice was barely a breath. "You're safe." She didn't know if that was true anymore. Sitting back down, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the brass key. It glinted faintly in the weak light. She turned it over in her fingers, tracing the grooves, the tag with its faded lettering. Car number 147, Union Pacific. It didn't just unlock steel, it unlocked everything her uncle had left behind. Truths that someone somewhere had buried deep enough to forget or hoped never to find. Sarah slipped the key back into her pocket and drew a shaky breath. The decision she'd been avoiding began to settle in her chest. Running wouldn't save them, neither would hiding. The only way out was through. She didn't know who these people were or what they wanted exactly, but she knew one thing with the kind of certainty that burned. She wouldn't let them take Ethan's safety or his innocence the way they'd taken her uncle's life. The first streak of dawn broke through the blinds, painting pale gold lines across the room. Ethan stirred again and blinked sleepily, sitting up. "Mom? Did you sleep?" Sarah forced a small smile and brushed a hand through his messy hair. "A little," she lied. "Go back to bed for a bit." But she knew she wouldn't sleep again. Not tonight. not until she knew how to end this. The train car had opened something she couldn't close, and whatever storm was coming, she'd face it head on. Because fear wasn't weakness anymore, it was proof of what she had to protect. The little museum sat like a relic of someone's stubborn love for the past, peeling paint on the door, brass plaques dull with years, a bell that gave a tired, half-hearted ring when Sarah pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled of oil and old velvet programs, of engine grease scrubbed into benches, and the kind of dust that held stories. Shelves were stacked with models, timetables yellowed from sun, and catalogs with spines cracked like knuckles. Behind a counter littered with postcards and enamel badges, an old man moved with a careful, slow certainty that made him seem part of the place itself. Harold ran a hand through a crown of white hair and looked up at her with eyes that had catalogued 1,000 horizons. "You must be the Dawson the papers mentioned," he said, his voice a low rasp softened by time. He'd read the ledger in the local Gazette, or maybe he'd simply recognized the way she carried the weight of something that didn't belong to her yet. "Car 137-147. He paused, letting the number sit in the air like a dropped coin. Sarah explained, not sparing details. The key, the diner man, the crates, the wax-stamped barrels. Harold listened with a frown deepening into a map of concern. He didn't interrupt, not because he had nothing to say, but because trains and their secrets demanded a kind of reverence. When she finished, the old man's face, which had been weathered into a series of small smiles and wry observations, lost color. It was as if the room had shifted and revealed a shadow he hadn't expected to meet. "Your uncle's car?" he said slowly, as if tasting the words. "Car number 147. He wiped his hands on a shop rag and motioned for her to follow him through a narrow corridor lined with photos of locomotives and men in grease-streaked overalls. They stopped before a glass case where a faded ledger lay open, entries in careful script recording consignments and repairs. Harold pulled up a stool and sat, folding his hands as if preparing for a truth too large to stand up to. "There's talk in our circles," he murmured. "Old men who used to work the sidings. Some of them died with their hands in their pockets, whispering the same thing. Ghost cargo. That's what they called anything that didn't show up on manifests, anything that the ledger refused to hold. Not contraband in the usual sense, too official for that. Stuff with the power to make people disappear from the paper trail, make them not exist where it mattered." He tapped the glass between them, a brittle sound. "Car number 147 has been mentioned like that, not by name exactly, by rumor, a thing you pass in a bar and then pretend you never heard." Sarah forced a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Cursed?" Harold shrugged, an old man's version of a shrug that carried more weight than a younger man's certainty. "Cursed is the word folks use when they want to stop asking questions, easier than admitting someone powerful enough buried something no court could touch. But listen, there's a story about a printer who got too close to a ledger that should have been buried. He vanished after a warehouse burned. Folks said he ran. Others whispered he was silenced. Your uncle, Arthur, he was the kind of man who could make his own disappearances look like accidents." Sarah felt something cold climb her spine. "You think he hid the car on purpose?" "I think he hid what he had to," Harold said, his voice small and steady. "If that car's still sealed, it wasn't a mistake. People don't go to the trouble of building false floors and then leave everything to chance. They plan. They bury. And if they think the thing can ruin names, they make it vanish, out of sight, out of ledger, out of reach." He reached into his drawer and pulled out a brittle atlas of rail sidings, flipping to a map marked in careful, faded pencil. "There are places people here won't touch unless they have to. Siding lines where only private cars go, owned by men with pockets too deep to show up on tax forms. Your uncle had connections. That's not unusual for someone in his line of work. What's unusual is that something tied to the treasury, if these stories are true, ended up in one of those cars." Sarah's jaw tightened. "What should I do? Burn the blueprint? Walk away like you told me?" Harold's eyes searched hers. And for a moment she saw years fold into his gaze, nights on platforms, men shaking hands in offices where deals were kissed and then buried. "Burning the blueprint hides ignorance," he said bluntly. "It doesn't erase interest. If anything, it invites questions. Why was she willing to walk away so easily?" He tapped the ledger gently. "If you leave it, it becomes history that someone else reads and gambles on. If you fight, well, then you draw the sort of attention that kills more quietly than guns. I won't lie to you, Sarah. If that car's sealed, whatever's inside is worth more than scrap and more dangerous than it looks. You can walk away, and they'll keep looking. Or you can open it and learn why men die for secrets." Her fingers closed around her thumb until the skin blanched. Harold watched without judgment, only an old man's pity that understands how the next words can bend the future. She thought of Ethan, asleep in a motel room despite the chaos outside, of the man in the gray suit's warning, of her uncle's faded name in syrupy black chalk. "Some curses," she said quietly, almost to herself, "aren't curses at all." "There are truths no one wanted to claim," Harold nodded, the lines at his eyes deepening, like railroad tracks stretching into the distance. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted low, and the little museum felt, for an instant, like the last safe place before a long crossing. The morning after her talk with Harold, Sarah drove back to the rail yard under a flat gray sky that seemed to stretch forever. The air was colder now, the kind of cold that bit at the edges of thought, leaving only the rhythm of determination to keep her moving. She didn't know what she expected to find, answers maybe, or confirmation that the fear threading through her had a shape, but she knew she couldn't leave that car's secrets half buried any longer. Ethan came with her again despite her protests, bundled in his hoodie, eyes bright with the sort of curiosity that refused to be dimmed. "If there's more down there," he said quietly as they approached car 147, "we'll find it this time." She wanted to tell him to stay outside, to let her face whatever ghosts her uncle had left behind, but she also knew he wouldn't listen. He had his father's stubborn streak, or maybe it was hers. The train car loomed like a tomb. Inside, dust lay thick and untouched since their last visit. The false floor still bore the faint scratches where she'd pried it open before, the sound of that groaning steel echoing faintly in her mind. She climbed inside, crouched, and set the crowbar to work again. Metal groaned, the sound a reluctant exhale, and the hatch lifted. What she hadn't noticed before was the small leather pouch wedged between two of the metal cases. It looked harmless, aged brown leather, cracked along the edges, the kind of thing a man might have kept in a coat pocket. She pulled it free, her fingers brushing against something solid inside. "Mom?" Ethan said, stepping closer. "It's okay," she murmured, though her voice didn't sound like her own. She unfastened the flap and pulled out a ledger bound in worn black leather, small enough to fit in one hand. Dust fell from it like ash. The pages inside were brittle and yellowed, filled with cramped handwriting and fading ink, numbers, letters, dates, hundreds of them. The language of accountants and secrets. Sarah turned one page after another, her pulse quickening as patterns began to form. Transactions, initials, amounts. Each entry carried the faint smell of ink and time. Ethan crouched beside her, peering over her shoulder. "Look, Mom," he said, pointing to a line halfway down a page. "Ward C, 2M. Sarah's breath caught. The name meant nothing to Ethan, but it crashed into her like a wave. Wardcorp Bank, still one of the largest financial institutions in the country. Her mind raced. If these were payments, they weren't small. $2 million, dated 1974, the year before her uncle vanished. She turned more pages, scanning frantically. More names leapt out, initials tied to corporations, political donors, defense contractors. The entries weren't random. They formed a network, a ledger of transactions no one was supposed to see. This wasn't stolen cash. This was evidence. A record of where that money had gone and who it had bought. Her hands trembled as she closed the book. "Oh my God," she whispered. Ethan frowned, confused by her tone. "Is it bad?" She looked at him, her mouth dry. "It's not money, Ethan." "It's worse. It's proof." He tilted his head. "Proof of what?" "Of the people who built their lives on lies," she said softly. "Of everything your uncle tried to expose." For a long time neither of them spoke. Dust drifted lazily through the air, catching the light that filtered through the cracks. The silence felt heavier now, as if the air itself knew the gravity of what they'd uncovered. Sarah slid the ledger into her jacket, her heart hammering. The money had been worth millions, but this was worth far more. Not in value, but in consequence. 25 million wasn't the treasure buried under her feet. It was the cost of silence, the price men paid to keep truth hidden. She looked around the car, suddenly aware of every shadow. Someone had been searching before, and they'd come up empty. But now she had what they'd been after all along. "Mom," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. "We should go." She nodded, closing the floor panel carefully and sliding it back into place. The sound of metal sealing against metal felt final, like the closing of a chapter she could never reopen safely again. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of dust and distance. Sarah locked the door behind her, even though she knew a lock wouldn't keep anyone out who really wanted in. As they walked back to the car, Ethan slipped his hand into hers, his grip small but sure. Sarah tightened her hold, glancing back once at the rusted shape of car 147. The truth wasn't buried anymore. It was in her pocket, bound in cracked leather and dangerous ink. Her uncle hadn't died protecting money. He'd died protecting the truth. And now, that truth belonged to her. The afternoon light was soft and gold when Sarah pulled into the school parking lot, the kind of light that usually made her feel calm. Today it only sharpened the edges of her nerves. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror for what felt like the 100th time since leaving the rail yard. No one. No headlights trailing her. Still, her stomach stayed tight, a knot that refused to loosen. When Ethan ran out through the school gates, his backpack bouncing and hair tousled by the wind, she tried to smile. He waved, and for a fleeting second she almost believed the world outside that moment didn't exist. But then she saw it. Across the street, half hidden behind the line of parked cars, sat a black SUV. Its windows were tinted, its engine silent. But she knew. The same one from before. And leaning against the hood like he owned the street was the man in the gray suit. The same calm expression. The same faint, unreadable smile. Sarah's breath caught. She forced herself not to freeze. She crouched slightly as Ethan reached her. "Hey, buddy," she said, her voice too bright. "How was school?" He shrugged. "We had art today." I drew the train car. Her throat tightened, but she only nodded, trying to keep her tone light. "That sounds nice." She ushered him quickly toward the car, keeping her body between him and the man across the street. She could feel his gaze like heat on her back. Once they were both inside, she started the engine. The SUV didn't move. The man didn't follow. But as she drove away, every instinct in her screamed that he wasn't done watching. By the time they reached the motel, the sun had slipped below the horizon. The desert air had cooled, carrying with it the smell of dust and oil. The parking lot looked ordinary enough. 2 semis idling near the far end, a couple arguing outside a neighboring room. But when she reached their door, something felt wrong. The handle. It wasn't locked. She pushed gently. The door swung inward with a slow, sickening creak. The room was dark except for the glow of the streetlight spilling through the blinds. Sarah's heart pounded in her ears. "Stay behind me," she whispered, her hand instinctively pressing against Ethan's chest. Inside, chaos. Drawers yanked out and overturned, clothes strewn across the carpet, the small table by the window flipped on its side, their suitcase gutted, its contents spilled like entrails. Her breath hitched when she saw it. Ethan's sketchbook torn apart, pages shredded and scattered like confetti. Then her eyes lifted to the mirror. Across its glass, scrawled in thick red lipstick, were 3 words that made her blood run cold. "Time's running out." Sarah's stomach lurched. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think. The letters gleamed under the motel light, like something alive. Then she turned sharply, pulling Ethan into her arms. He was trembling. "Mom, what does that mean?" She pressed her face into his hair, trying to breathe through the panic clawing up her throat. "It means," she whispered, forcing her voice to stay steady, "we're leaving. Right now." Ethan clung to her, confusion giving way to fear. Who did this? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The lipstick message told her everything. Someone had been here. Someone had touched their things. Someone had wanted her to know it. Her hand shook as she gathered what little they had left. The ledger, the key, her wallet. Everything else was replaceable. She shoved them into her bag, her movements frantic but precise. Years of single motherhood had taught her how to move fast when the world turned on her. As they hurried out, Ethan stopped in the doorway, looking back at his ruined sketchbook. The small, quiet heartbreak in his eyes nearly undid her. "They ruined it," he said softly. Sarah swallowed hard. "I know, baby, but we'll make new ones. Better ones, I promise." Outside, the night felt too still, too aware. She could feel eyes on them again, even if she couldn't see from where. Somewhere beyond the flickering motel sign, the desert stretched out vast and empty. For the first time, she realized how small they were inside it. She started the car and gripped the steering wheel so tight, her fingers ached. Ethan sat silent beside her, staring at the window. They drove into the dark without looking back. Behind them, the motel room door swung gently in the wind, tapping against the frame like a heartbeat. Sarah didn't know where they were going or how long they could keep ahead of whoever was hunting them. But one thing was certain now. The line between them and the people chasing the past had vanished. This wasn't about curiosity anymore. It wasn't about the money or the truth or her uncle's sins. It was about survival. And she would burn the world to keep her son safe. The motel phone rang just past midnight, its shrill tone cutting through the silence like a blade. Sarah startled awake, her heart leaping to her throat. For a second she thought it was just another dream, the kind where shadows followed her even when she ran. But the phone kept ringing, relentless, demanding. She slipped out of bed carefully so as not to wake Ethan, who was curled up under the thin blanket, breathing softly. The digital clock glowed 12:03 a.m., in red against the dark. She hesitated before answering, her fingers trembling. "Hello?" For a moment nothing. Then a voice, low and steady, filled the line. "Miss Dawson?" Her breath caught. That voice, smooth, calm, the kind that belonged to men who never raised it because they never needed to. "Who is this?" she whispered, though she already knew. "You know who I am," the man said, the faintest hint of a smile threading through the words. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Sarah's throat tightened. "If this is about the car—" "It's not about the car anymore," he interrupted, his tone still soft, almost conversational. "You have the ledger." She said nothing. The silence stretched, fragile and heavy. "Bring it tomorrow," he continued, "or the boy doesn't come home from school." Her knees buckled. She gripped the edge of the table to stay upright. "Don't you touch him." The man exhaled, unbothered. "You have my word. Do as you're told, and no harm comes to the child. Simple, really." Her voice cracked. "How do I know you won't—" "You don't," he said. "But you'll risk it if you don't believe me." A pause. 10 a.m. Tomorrow. The rail yard. Click. The line went dead. For a long moment Sarah just stood there, the receiver pressed to her ear, her pulse pounding loud enough to drown out the world. Then the sound came back in pieces, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustle of the curtains, Ethan's breathing. She hung up slowly, the phone feeling heavier than it should have. Her legs gave out and she sank to the floor. The walls of the motel seemed to shrink around her, the beige wallpaper closing in. The air felt too thin to breathe. She'd survived so much already, years of scraping by on diner wages, of pretending she wasn't afraid, of convincing Ethan that things would get better when most days she wasn't sure she believed it herself. But this was different. This wasn't hunger or loneliness. This was the purest, cruelest kind of fear, the kind that only existed in mothers who had something they couldn't afford to lose. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to press them against her knees to stop them. Across the room, Ethan stirred, but didn't wake. His hair had fallen across his face, and for a fleeting second, he looked impossibly young, 10 years old, too small to understand the kind of world that hunted innocence. She stood and crossed to the nightstand, pulling open the drawer. The ledger sat inside, its worn leather cover almost mocking in its silence. The key to everything, the reason they were being hunted. She picked it up and ran her fingers along the spine. It was smooth from use, warm from her touch, and heavier now with meaning. Arthur Dawson hadn't just left her an inheritance. He'd left her a war, one fought not with guns, but with greed and silence, corruption and cover-ups. He had buried truth under steel and ink, and now the truth had clawed its way back into the world. She looked again at Ethan, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, unaware that his life had just become someone else's bargaining chip. She pressed the ledger to her chest, closing her eyes. "You won't take him," she whispered into the dark. "You won't." But the promise trembled even as she said it, because deep down, Sarah knew there were some wars you didn't get to win. You just fought until you couldn't anymore. Outside, the wind howled across the desert, rattling the motel sign until it flickered and went dark. Inside, Sarah sat awake until dawn, every sound sharpening her nerves, every breath laced with terror. Her uncle's secret had finally come to collect its debt, and she was the last Dawson left to pay it. The diner hummed with the low, familiar noise of late-night regulars and the sputter of the coffee machine. But for Sarah, it felt like the world had narrowed to the single rectangle of light over their booth. She sat hunched, the ledger heavy on the vinyl seat beside her, its leather creased where years of hands had closed it and opened it again. Ethan slept with his head in her lap, breath soft and even. A mound of exhaustion that looked too small to carry the day's terror. His sneakers poked out from under the bench, dust still clinging to the rubber. She could feel the weight of the ledger like a second heartbeat against her thigh. The pages inside contained more than numbers. They carried names that could topple men, dates that threaded conspiracies through decades, entries that turned polite business into something ugly and deliberate. Her thumb brushed the spine, and she imagined the man in the gray suit smile, the way he'd leafed an envelope of money across the hood of her car, as if buying her silence were the most reasonable exchange in the world. Every instinct told her to hand it over, to trade the ledger for a number that would make their lives quiet and ordinary again, mortgage paid, school trips covered, the freedom to breathe without watching every parked car. 100,000, 200,000, the amounts blurred into a dream of peace she'd never allowed herself before. She pictured Ethan older, secure, the kind of life she hadn't thought possible in years. It should have been an easy choice. But then she thought about running. She had rehearsed the idea in the small hours between shifts. Pack a bag, get Ethan on the road away from anyone with a suit and a smile, change names, change towns, live with the soft anxiety of always watching the rear view. She pictured a life of constant movement, always a step ahead of the shadow that wanted what the ledger proved. She pictured Ethan growing up believing safety was a train that never stopped. And she thought about her uncle, Arthur, whose name was now ink and dust and a ledger she could hold, had hidden something so dangerous he disappeared rather than let it speak. Had he fled? Had he tried to expose it and been erased by those with power? Sarah closed her eyes and could see the photograph from the records office. A man half remembered, reported dead in a warehouse fire with no body recovered. A man who had built his life around printing, around the kind of machines that render paper official and irrevocable, and then vanished with what shouldn't have existed. If she gave it up, those men would keep their names clean and their reputations untouchable. If she ran, the ledger would still exist somewhere in the world, a prize waiting for the next person who wasn't afraid to sell it back to the highest bidder. The ledger was not just money. It was the kind of dangerous truth that propagated itself if left unchallenged. Ethan shifted in his sleep and mumbled. She watched the slow rise and fall of his shoulders and felt a fierceness settle in her chest that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with love. This wasn't about pride. It wasn't about making a point. It was about the small boy who trusted his mother to make the right call, no matter how impossible. She picked up the ledger and felt the leather warm under her palms. The diner's neon sign blinked in the window, casting the place in intermittent pink and blue. She thought of the man who had offered her money on a car hood and the casual threat he'd let hang in the air like a promise. She thought of the sheriff's office file with its redactions and the way the letters, unresolved, had scraped at her like a dare. When she finally spoke, it was barely audible, a vow cut soft but absolute. "We don't run," she told the sleeping boy, and the words felt like armor. "We don't sell." She slid the ledger into her bag and zipped it shut with deliberate fingers. Outside, the highway hummed under a slow, indifferent traffic. Inside, the diner's warmth wrapped around them like a fragile shelter. Whatever came next, lawsuits, threats, late-night calls, she would face it. Not because she fancied herself heroic, but because the ledger had chosen her by bloodline, and because some things were worse than fear. She reached down and smoothed Ethan's hair back from his forehead. "We fight," she said, to him and to herself. And in the small quiet that followed, the decision felt less like a burden and more like a promise. The county courthouse smelled like floor wax and old decisions, the kind of place where people learn to lower their voices and clutch paper like prayer. Sarah walked in with the ledger heavy in her bag, each step echoing off the marble floor like a heartbeat. She had slept maybe an hour, the motel's thin walls full of memories of lipstick threats and torn sketchbooks, but the exhaustion only made the resolve sharper. Ethan's face floated behind her eyelids, small, trusting, and she pushed that image into the front of her mind like a shield. At the front desk, the bailiff looked at her as if she had wandered in from the wrong decade. Courthouse business was usually suits and subpoenas, not single parents with rusted keys and conspiracies. She asked for the district attorney. He raised an eyebrow but made the call, a little bored, a little curious. 15 minutes later, she was ushered into a narrow conference room where light fell across a long table, papers stacked in neat columns like promises. The district attorney walked in with the sort of quiet authority that filled a room without loudness, a man in his 50s with steady hands and an expression that suggested he had seen too many truths strung out to be surprised. He sat, folded his hands, and asked for her story. Sarah told it without the frills, the inheritance, the train car, the printing press, the broken padlock, the barrels sealed with wax, the ledger she'd found tucked under false floorboards. She didn't dramatize. There wasn't time for drama. There was only the ledger and the constellations of names in it. When she finally unzipped her bag and laid the ledgers on the table, the room changed temperature. The DA reached out and opened the cover with fingers that suddenly looked very careful. He scanned the pages, his forehead creasing as names, initials, dates, and amounts fell into order under his gaze. He flipped back and forth with the practiced eye of a man who could read intent in ink. The room, once filled with polite air, fell into a silence that felt like the hush after a storm. "You brought this to me?" he asked quietly, not the incredulous challenge she'd expected, but the weight of a man who understood the map of consequences. "Do you realize what this means?" She met his eyes. "I do." He closed the ledger and leaned back. "Half this county will want you dead." The bluntness of it landed like a fist. He wasn't scaring her. He was naming the cost. She felt it then. Every crooked handshake, Every ledger line more than ink was a thread tied to someone powerful and dangerous. Men with reputations, with offices, with ways to make people vanish from records and from life. "My son doesn't leave town," she said, voice steady, though her hands trembled. "You can arrest me, lock me up with the ledger, whatever you need. But if anyone ever touches Ethan, there won't be a ledger left to read. You can put me in a cell. You can put me on the stand. But you will not let my son die because I chose to tell the truth." The DA's mouth hardened into a line. He was a prosecutor. He knew the calculus of risk. He also remembered why he'd taken the job, not for the headlines, not for the promotions, but for moments when truth actually had a chance to matter. He looked at the pages again, then at her. The ledger's weight suddenly shared between them. "All right," he said at last, low and decisive. "We'll do this the right way. You give me what you have. We'll verify, cross-check, and if this holds up, we indict. But you will cooperate fully. No leaks, no interviews, no wandering off on your own. We tighten security for you and your son. Temporary relocation. Witness protection protocols while the investigation runs. We move carefully and legally, because the minute this becomes a spectacle, we lose the leverage." Sarah's breath left her in a long, ragged exhale. "And if you fail?" she asked, because she had to hear the truth of it. He met her gaze without flinching. "Then we answer to the consequences. But we'll try. That's the promise. We go by the book. We build a case that can't be buried." His voice had a professional firmness that felt like an anchor. She nodded, and for the first time in days, felt like the panic loosened just a fraction. It wasn't safety. No single meeting could buy that, but it was a plan. A legal route cut through the morass. She slid the ledger across the table to him like handing over a lit match and whispered, "Make sure my son lives." He closed the ledger and set it between them, a pact in ink and paper. Outside the window, the courthouse steps were already busy with people who had no idea what had just changed in their county. Inside, Sarah straightened, squared her shoulders, and felt the sharp, strange clarity of someone who'd decided to stand in the open rather than run in circles forever. The gamble was enormous. But the ledger wasn't hers to sell. It was a story that had cost men too much already, not least her uncle. And she'd chosen, with a mother's stubbornness, to see it through. The news broke before sunrise. Sarah woke to the sound of voices outside the motel door. Reporters, cameras, the unmistakable hum of chaos finding a target. She didn't have to turn on the television to know what had happened. Her phone was already vibrating off the nightstand, the headlines lighting the screen like tiny fires. The Dawson Ledger exposed. Local woman uncovers multi-million-dollar cover-up. Her stomach sank. She had known it would get out eventually, but not this fast. Not like this. She slipped on her jacket and peered through the blinds. A wall of flashing bulbs blinded her. News vans crowded the parking lot. Microphones jutted like weapons from a crowd of strangers, all shouting her name. Ethan stirred behind her, rubbing his eyes. "Mom? What's happening?" She turned, forcing calm into her voice. "Just some people with cameras. Go get dressed, okay?" By the time she opened the door, the swarm descended. Voices tripped over each other, questions snapping like rubber bands. "Miss Dawson, do you believe your uncle was murdered?" "How much of the ledger did you turn over? Are you afraid for your life?" The sheriff's deputy who'd been stationed outside the night before pushed through the crowd, shielding her with his arm. "Back up, everyone! She's under protection!" he barked. But it was useless. Once a secret saw daylight, there was no putting it back in the dark. By noon, the motel was surrounded by satellite trucks. Politicians were already on the news, denying everything. Bank executives held press conferences, promising full cooperation with authorities. The same people who had once hunted her now scrambled to explain themselves to cameras. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Across the room, Ethan sat cross-legged, watching the muted TV. On the screen, her own face stared back at her from a still photo the news had found somewhere, probably her old driver's license. The caption read, "Sarah Dawson, the woman behind the ledger." He looked at her, wide-eyed. "You're on TV," he said, a mix of awe and confusion. "I guess I am," she murmured. He crossed the room and climbed onto the bed beside her, slipping his hand into hers. "Are we in trouble?" She squeezed his fingers. "Not anymore," she said. "They can't hide now." Outside, the reporters' shouts faded beneath the rising hum of helicopters. The FBI had reopened cases long buried, ones that connected her uncle's disappearance to the ledger's names. Men who had built empires on lies were suddenly claiming amnesia. The DA's office issued a statement confirming that the ledger was real, that investigations were underway. The world was finally paying attention. And yet, with the exposure came a strange kind of safety. The men who once worked in shadows couldn't move now, not when every eye in the country was watching. The light had made them cautious, hesitant. They had power, yes, but power prefers silence. And Sarah had taken that away. She sat with Ethan as the sun began to set, the motel curtains glowing orange. Her phone buzzed with messages, some threats, some gratitude. Strangers called her brave. Commentators called her reckless. To Sarah, it didn't matter what label they gave. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She wasn't the tired waitress pouring coffee for men who never learned her name. She wasn't the single mother counting tips by the flicker of a neon light. She was the woman who had cracked open a $25 million lie and watched the truth bleed out into daylight. Ethan leaned his head against her shoulder. "Do you think Uncle Arthur would be proud?" he asked softly. Sarah's throat tightened. She looked out the window, where the sunset melted into the desert. "Yeah," she whispered. "I think he finally gets to rest." Outside, the cameras kept flashing, each burst of light another reminder that the storm had broken. And somehow, against all odds, she was still standing in it. The desert had changed. Where there had once been silence and ruin, there was now a gleaming monument to memory. The rail yard had been cleared, the sand brushed away, the weeds cut back. Car number 147 sat proudly on a restored siding under the wide blue Nevada sky, no longer a secret rusting away in the dust, but a story preserved behind glass and care. The brass plaque beside it read, "The Dawson Car," dedicated to those who believed truth should not be buried. Sarah stood beside the display window, her reflection faint in the polished steel, the sun bright enough to warm the air through the glass. She could still see the ghost of the old car if she closed her eyes, the broken lock, the torn tarps, the smell of time. But now it looked different. New paint gleamed against the sky, and inside the artifacts had been arranged like chapters in a history no one could ignore. The printing press, the crates, even one of the sealed barrels, its wax stamp perfectly intact. It wasn't just her uncle's story anymore, it was the world's. The ledger had done what her uncle couldn't. It had forced the truth into daylight. Names had fallen like dominoes in the months that followed, executives, bankers, and politicians who had treated corruption as inheritance. Trials were televised, statements read. The recovered money, close to $25 million, went into restitution funds and community programs, the same kind of causes Arthur Dawson had once dreamed of supporting. Sarah didn't see any of it personally, not a dollar. But she didn't mind. Her rewards were smaller, quieter, more certain. She and Ethan had moved into a modest house near his new school with a tiny yard and a front porch that creaked when you leaned on the railing. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The bills got paid on time. The nights were still. Sometimes she'd catch herself marveling at the normalcy. Laundry drying in the sun, the smell of breakfast on a weekend morning. For years, she'd lived in motion. Fear pressed against her ribs. Now, for the first time, she could just breathe. She'd taken a job with the museum that managed the Dawson Foundation's exhibits. It made her laugh at first, the waitress who once scrubbed tables now guiding visitors through the corridors of her own history. But it felt right. Every day she told her uncle's story to school groups and curious travelers, how one man's conscience had been too loud to silence, how his niece had found the key he left behind. She told it gently, without embellishment. The truth was strong enough to stand on its own. Ethan flourished in the calm. The nightmares that had once woken him in the middle of the night had faded, replaced by the scratch of pencils and the smell of eraser dust. He drew train cars now, sleek, detailed ones with shining windows and tracks that curved into a bright horizon. He'd bring them to her, eyes wide with pride, and she'd hang them on the fridge next to his report cards. His drawings didn't look haunted anymore. They looked like possibility. On weekends, they still drove out to the museum, parking at the edge of the old siding where the desert began again. The two of them would walk the length of Car 147, tracing their fingers along the steel, letting the sunlight settle over them. The wind carried the faint hum of trains still running somewhere beyond sight, distant but constant. Ethan would always stop halfway down the car, palm pressed to the cool metal. "Mom," he'd whisper, his voice soft but full of wonder, "it doesn't look rusty anymore." And every time, Sarah smiled. Not because the paint was new or the metal polished, but because he was right, in a way deeper than he knew. The car wasn't rusting anymore, and neither were they. The fear, the hiding, the weight of secrets, they'd been scrubbed away by truth and time. Some things, she'd learned, are never measured in money or headlines. They're measured in the courage it takes to open a locked door and face what waits on the other side. As the wind swept through the desert, whistling against the tracks like a long, steady note, Sarah closed her eyes and felt the warmth of sunlight on her face. For the first time, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like the start of a new track. If this story moved you, even just a little, take a moment to share it. Leave a comment below. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and what part of Sarah and Ethan's journey stayed with you most. And if you believe that truth, courage, and love still matter in a world that sometimes forgets them, hit that subscribe button, because more stories like this are on the way, and you won't want to miss what comes next.